¿Alguna vez te has preguntado cómo asegurarte de que la persona que está sirviendo tu cerveza tiene las competencias adecuadas para poder hacer una buena selección? ¿O para saber cómo asegurarse que esa cerveza llegue a tu mesa en su mejor calidad? Pues te explico. La certificación de Cicerone sería como el equivalente de un sommelier en el mundo del vino. La certificación de Cicerone tiene varios niveles en los cuales se miden las competencias del candidato y su conocimiento sobre distintos estilos de cervezas, mantenimiento del sistema de dispensado de cerveza, así como su habilidad de parear o maridar distintos platos. La invitada de hoy es una Cicerón avanzada y nos habla más sobre el proceso de cómo parear o maridar comidas con distintas cervezas y también nos habla de otras cosas muy interesantes que ella ha hecho durante su carrera. Espero que disfruten este episodio. Bienvenidos a The Food Engineer Podcast, un podcast dedicado a la exploración de alimentos y bebidas fermentadas. Yo soy tu anfitrión, Cristian Mercado. Welcome to a new episode of the Food Engineer Podcast. Today we have a very interesting guest. We have Mandy Naglich. She is a beer writer, she's a home brewer, she's a social media personality. Welcome, Mandy. How are you?
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for accepting this invitation. Mandy, for those who don't know you, would you care to give us a little bit of a bio about Mandy?
Sure. Yeah, I'm an advanced Cicerone, so I'm into beer education and kind of learning about classic styles and beer science, which, like you said, I share on my social media profiles and through freelance writing and my website, beerswithmandy.com. So I share everything I've learned homebrewing and studying for all these tests and hope to get people more interested in beer that they maybe haven't heard of before.
That's great. I want to mention to folks that are listening that the way that I got to meet Mandy was because she beat me. And she beat me in a way that is a little bit unconventional for some people, but we were competing at the same time at the National Homebrewers competition. And on the porter category during the pandemic, I was watching TV, waiting for the results, and it turns out that Mandy had won first place at NHC. So even though it's a little bit late, I want to congratulate you for your win.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really unexpected and exciting. I wasn't actually watching it, and then I got all these Instagram messages at once. So that was cool. It was the Imperial Stout that I had that ended up getting that. There's so many beers in that category: stouts and porters and Imperial Stout. So congrats also on competing.
Oh,
It's a
thanks.
great. I always try to get people to enter their beers into that competition.
Yeah, and I would like to tell people as well, if you want to go into learning more about beer, I think there's no better way than putting your beer out there for experts and beer judges to tell you what they think about that beer. And honestly, they're pretty good about it. I have never received negative feedback.
Yeah, yeah, I think yeah, and I think it's like you never get a third party who totally doesn't know you and you're like sampling with your friends or family or even when you bring it to like breweries or something for people to try. It's nice when someone, totally objectively gives you scores. So,
Yeah. Granted, they do this on a tight timeline, so the amount of
mhm.
feedback that they can give you sometimes is minimal, but they tend to be very constructive, and I'm glad that I've done that before. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
definitely.
But this is not about me. This is about Mandy. So, Mandy, can you tell us a little bit more about your role as a writer?
Yeah, I'm the homebrewing columnist for VinePair, which has been really cool. Like it's been a couple years now, so every month we kind of explore a different beer style and how you can make it at home with tips from either pros or fellow homebrewers. And then I freelance. I have work for Good Beer Hunting. I have a new farmhouse beer story coming out with them soon. Vice, Food and Wine, all those kind of different internet platforms that would be interested in either beer stories or technical information about different beers.
It is rare that we get someone that has the ability to, number one, have the technical expertise on being an advanced Cicerone, and also having the spoken word or written word ability to put those sentiments into something that people can digest and understand. Can you tell us a little bit more about the process that you went through to become an advanced Cicerone?
Yeah, I think the cool thing about the Cicerone program is that it's self-study. So you get a syllabus and you know you need to know the things on the syllabus, but you can decide to read or learn, hands-on learning, however works best for you. I also have my W set in spirits, and that's a little different. It's not self-guided, it's classroom study and doing exercises with the teacher. So I think either way, I love learning, and I think getting these kind of certifications helps guide my learning into ways that are productive, and so that I know that I'm covering a topic until I'm an expert. But I think there's different ways to do things. You know, some people like the self study of Cicero and the fact that they can do it whenever they have time, they can learn at their own pace. And then there's other programs that like WSET and things like that, or even certified cider professional that are a little more guided, a little more telling you exactly what you need to know. You have time to memorize that, taste through that, and then take the tests, and you know what's going to be on them. So,
So, for those who are not familiar with W set and Cicerone, W set focuses more on wine and spirits, whereas Cicerone's focuses on beer. Some people call Cicerone sommelier of beer. And well, essentially, Mandy is at the top tier or near the top tier of sommeliers of beer. So, congratulations for that as well.
yeah, thank you so much.
So, talking about that, and I know that in the world of W set and also in the world of Cicerone, food pairings are a big deal because at the forefront of producing beer is tasting beer and having the end consumers enjoy that beer. And the Cicerone is that person that presents you with options, that tries to assess your needs, wants, and likes, and put a good beer in front of that so that your experience is more wholesome. So, what are some of the elements or some of the tips and tricks that Mandy uses when it comes to pairing food and beer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing when it comes to pairing is more avoiding things that clash. I think there's a lot of beers that go with a lot of dishes. I think beer goes better with food than a lot of people consider. So as long as it's something that someone is interested in drinking, they like the style of beer, and it's not really going to clash with the dish, I think that's the most important element. And then after that would be matching intensities, right? You never want the beer to totally overpower what you eat. You never want what you're eating to totally overpower the flavors of beer. So you wouldn't want a really subtle something like a Pilsner with a really strong blue cheese, just because you would not be able to taste that Pilsner at all. But other than that, I really think pairings are a beer that you like with food that you like. And as long as there's nothing really clashing, I think most pairings work out pretty well. Sometimes I think we put a little too much emphasis on exactly why every dish has to go with like exactly the right beer. And I think those really amazing beer pairings are a little few and far between. You know, that one where something will like totally transform the way you understand the dish. And for the most part, it's just getting good beer and good food in front of people and letting them enjoy themselves.
It's great. In the book, The Brewmaster's Table by Garrett Oliver, he mentions several pairings, and I like how he creates this bridging concept of if your cherry pie has this graham cracker cross or something like that, you would find a beer that has these Maillard reaction notes to it to pair it
Mhm.
together. And it seems that sometimes these concepts of pairing can get a little bit poetic as well. So I like how you treat it in a way that, hey, most beer is really good with food. You just
Yeah.
have to find the one that works for you.
Definitely. And you can definitely spend time, you know, going in, like you said, you're looking for, maybe it's a cherry pie, so you're going to pair with something English because it has that little bit of cherry ester flavor from the fermentation in English beers, and you're going to make sure that pie has a dark crust because that complements the malt flavors in the beer, and you're going to contrast the texture with the carbonation and everything like that. But I think that can actually get overwhelming to people sometimes, and they're like, okay, never mind, I'll just have whatever your house beer is and not like think so deeply about this. And another way, I mean, I think we've talked about this before too, is pairing like culturally is really interesting, right? If there is a beer style from the country where the dish is from, it's always interesting to present those two things together so people can kind of think more about the origin of both their food and their beer. Um,
Certainly. There is a certain nostalgic component to some of these, and I feel that the same thing goes with food. Oftentimes, we have pairings like pie and ice cream. Who would have thought that pie and ice cream would go together? But if we've had pie and ice cream as kids, it sounds that pie and ice cream together would go great. And if there's like a beer that has like cherry, like a milk stout with cherry, would go perhaps good with like a cherry pie with ice cream.
mhm,
And it seems that part of it is in our minds. But would you
definitely.
say that in terms of a technical food pairing versus a food pairing that is more useful for everyday eating, uh, do you tend to then simplify it a little bit more so that folks can enjoy, put more time into their experience than to think about the pairing?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as far as like technical, right, there's a few flavor interactions that we know to be true. Like salt always is going to tamp down on bitterness perception simply because the way our tongues work. Like literally our salt hitting our tongue is literally going to change the perception of bitterness. Same thing with sour and sweetness. You know, Sweetness is going to literally change the way your tongue perceives sourness. But beyond that, there's actually science is going back and forth for a while. There was this like theory that molecules, for example, molecules in champagne mirror some molecules that are in oysters, and they thought that's why those things went together. But as we've gone through studies and tried out these theories, it's turned out that that's not true. So people, many scientists have kind of rejected this theory that it's like the similar molecules is what makes things work. So I think trying to stay away from the technicalities, except for things that we know to be true, right? If something is super, super bitter or super, super, there's no salt in the dish, it's super sweet or something. Maybe you don't want to pair something super, super bitter with that, right? We know those basics. But beyond that, I think, we're all still learning about food pairing. It's something that science has really only taken on in the last decade or so to really study and start to understand. So as long as I think people are enjoying it, and to your point, you can tell a good story. You can make people remember the pairing maybe because the story you tell about the brewery or the dish, or a story that you tell about why the flavors work together. I think that's the thing that people, cicerones or whoever the beer professional and chef are, can tell that are a little more interesting than really trying to get into these like super technical, this specific molecule is going to contrast this in the dish and vice versa.
I like that you bring that up. I was taking a class some time ago about the science of tasting.
Hmm.
And the first thing that the professor said on day one was, you remember that tongue map that they put out there where like there's bitter, saltiness, spicy? Forget
Hmm.
about it. It is not
Yeah.
true. Don't put that out there. Don't follow that. Don't tell people to follow that. Let's focus on what is actually happening. And I like
Yeah.
that you make it so that it is useful for folks.
Yeah, and it's like we can think of each of like ourselves as all having our own tongue maps that are really built on our experience. If you had never tasted a blueberry, maybe you're from Europe or somewhere that, I think it's Lala berry they typically have instead of blueberry. But if you've never tasted a blueberry, you're not going to taste the blueberry note in an imperial stout that has like a little bit of berryness to it, right? You're going to think it tastes more like cherry or a flavor that you're familiar with. So when we're coming to these pairings, we have to know everyone's coming with a different experience, and you want to present them in a way that anyone can understand them, and everyone can take their own perception of them and enjoy them in their own way.
Talking about enjoying their own life, talking about people and their different backgrounds,
Mhm.
making a recipe for a beer is something that would inherently depend on your life experiences and how you approach food and drinks. How does
Mhm.
Mandy go about building a beer recipe?
That's a good question. I think really one of the first things I think about when I'm building a beer recipe is the alcohol I want it to end up with, the ABV I want it to end up with. So, how much grain, how much sugar am I going to have to get out of the grains to end up at that alcohol? For example, if I want a really light, 3 or 4% beer, I need to think about ways to build in flavor that isn't using a ton of malt, that isn't going to overpower that malt or overpower that balance of the beer. Whereas something, I like to brew like a nice 7 or 8% saison, and I can kind of build around the malt character and then build my hops and other flavors into it. So I think starting with the alcohol is important because it kind of determines what yeast you need to use as well. If you have a high alcohol beer, you're going to need to use a yeast that can survive at 10, 11%, whatever you're going for, and that kind of limits you. And once you kind of know that, how much alcohol you want to get, what yeast you're going to use to get there, you can kind of back things into it. Especially, I really like to use Belgian yeast that gives us those nice fruity, estery flavors, some palm fruits, maybe some stone fruits from that, as well as the phenols, which are like your little bit of peppery, um, maybe like clove spicy flavors. And so if it's going to have so much flavor from the yeast, I'm probably not going to overpower that with a bunch of flavor from hops, or a huge malt flavor. I want that yeast flavor to be able to come through. So kind of building that backwards is usually how I work it out.
That's an interesting approach. And I
Hmm.
say that because you mentioned two beer styles that are near and dear to my heart, especially Saison. I think I brew the same Saison recipe every single year for the last 7 years.
Nice.
And I like that you approach it from alcohol and malt before approaching it from hops, because
Hmm.
lately there's been a big trend on putting most of your focus on different hops, how they play together,
Hmm.
late hop additions, dry hopping, dip hopping, etc. And
Right.
you're going from alcohol and malt, which I think are the building blocks of beer.
Right.
How do you go then about building a recipe for something like a saison where you expect it to be dry? You expect it to be high in alcohol. What are some considerations that you take in mind?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, I mean, something like a saison, I love using that French saison yeast, the 3711,
My
more
favorite.
than, yeah, that will really definitely get things dry. It will definitely attenuate all the way out. So I think that's really important. And then knowing that the saison is going to be very dry, I do like to use some kind of protein, like so it may be a flaked malt or a flaked oat or a flaked wheat, just to keep some mouthfeel there, so it's not so dry it ends up feeling watery. But again, that's thinking about the yeast first, right? Like I know how the yeast is going to affect the final beer. So what do I need to do to either balance those yeast characteristics or accentuate them? So then I love all those yeast characteristics, like we said, of 3711. So I'm not going to use a ton of hops. I use a little Styrian, just because that's classic to give you that little grassy herbal flavor, maybe a little bit of Saaz. But nothing, I really want to showcase that yeast, get it nice and dry, and have that like refreshing farmhouse ale aspects to it. So that's kind of how, yeah, I would think about building out a Saison recipe.
That's cool. You're focusing more on more noble type of hubs, or close to noble, as
Hmm.
opposed to New World hubs. I
Hmm.
would say personally, my favorite hub for some saisons is Nelson Sauvin,
Uh-huh. You like that
because
grapey.
yes, and for some
Hmm.
reason, the interaction between the hops and yeast lends out a bit of a citric note to it,
Hmm.
which is a little bit unexpected, but it goes really well with a refreshing, spritzy type of beer, like a dry, high alcohol saison.
Yeah, definitely.
So, going back to the part of beer and food, and I know that I like to bounce back and forward because we can introduce the topic separate and then join them together.
Mhm.
Um, what are some of Mandy's favorite food and beer pairings, and what are some no nos?
That's good. Yeah, I think. when I was bringing out the beginning, like the clashing, I do feel that like very dry stouts, like maybe your Irish stouts and any stout with that like really roast forward malt profile, you know, your coffee, roasty, almost ash-like flavors, I do think can be tough with a lot of foods. It just kind of has that clash where it almost is like metallic when things are a little bit too roasty against your food. Those are ones that I steer away from. But really, I love doing like a beer with cheese plates and trying the beer with like the three different cheeses or the different charcuteries and seeing what I like the most. I really don't think there's a lot of huge no-nos. Maybe a good interaction to know that's a big no-no is really spicy food with a really bitter beer. Your bitterness is going to accentuate that spiciness on your palate. So that would maybe be a no-no unless you're really looking to sweat it out. Usually we look to our drink to kind of get some relief from that spiciness. So that would be a big no-no. But I really don't think there's a lot of things that I avoid. And as far as favorite pairings, like I said, it's whatever my favorite beer is on the menu for the most part with whatever I want to order. I like trying different beers with dishes. Every now and then you'll be like, oh, this one definitely works better. But I find it very rare that someone orders a beer with their dish and is like, this is terrible together. This is awful. You know, it's more about pairing what you're interested in and seeing how they work.
Professor Doug Miller from Hotel School at Cornell University
Uh-huh.
has this two perspectives that I found very interesting, and one of them pairs very well with what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
He did a study where they provided the same type of hot wings to everybody, but different beers. And
Uh-huh.
then they collected the data as to how people thought how spicy the wings were. And people
Mm-hmm.
that were given hoppier beers and more alcoholic beers rated those wings hotter as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the more, pilsners and pale ales type of deal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the other thing that he mentioned is that salmon and IPA don't go well together. So, uh,
Yeah, I think a lot of fish can get that kind of like almost metallic quality up against hops, or like I said, up against that like roasted malt flavor. I do think you can find salmon like now that we have the hazy IPAs that are, you know, not so bitter and maybe a little softer. I don't think that would totally be a clash, you know. But definitely your classic like American West Coast IPA. I could totally see those flavors not working at all.
yeah, clashing a little bit.
Yeah.
Continuing this trend of food pairings,
Hmm.
when we go to most all American bars, at least I used to travel a lot for work, and you always end up in the first bar that you find. And normally, the first thing that you get to eat is something fried. Do you have any
Hmm.
tips for your usual American appetizers and beers?
I mean, the thing is that like American light lagers work great with that. Something that's really high carbonation, you know, if you're looking for a lighter beer, a light lager, but I also think like really highly carbonated like a Belgian Golden Strong is going to work great with that. You want to kind of lift some of that fried and greasiness off of your palate, and that's literally just like the mechanics of the bubbles more than even the flavor. And I think the thing that's nice about a Pilsner or American Lager or Golden Strong is they have a pretty, you know, balance. It's not going to be an overpowering flavor. So if you are switching from like your jalapeno poppers that are fried to your, you know, I don't know, fried calamari or something, it's a beer that is kind of versatile. It can work across. You order a spread of appetizers for everyone. All three of those beers, you know, your classic Pilsner, your American light lager, and a Belgian Golden Strong are not going to offer flavors that are going to overpower anything like that. If anything, maybe the breading on all of those fried things are just going to complement that malt profile. So I really think when you're going greasy, I always say like high carbonation um, is really nice with those kind of foods to keep the palate clean and not feel too weighed down.
Great. Keep that in mind, folks. Always have your light lagers handy. Um, I know that a lot of folks tend to go heavy on the light lagers or criticize big
Mhm.
brewers, but it takes a lot of work to make a light lager. And it's a
Yeah.
type of beer that lets you see if there's any mistakes very easily. So
Mhm.
I would say there should be appreciation for all beer styles, just like there should be appreciation for all people.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I mean, it's funny because like our light lagers aren't so different from like the American cream ale style, or even like the Kentucky Common. And I don't know why those beers haven't taken off more because they also would be nice with American fried food. And I think they're very approachable. So maybe that's something that's going to happen too. Underappreciated styles kind of making an appearance.
That said, what is the type of beer that Mandy gravitates to most times as a drinker?
Yeah, yeah, I'm definitely I'm a fan of Belgian beer. So both the Abbey kind of style ales, the farmhouse ales, things that are spontaneous, like your lambic and your goose, everything I like. I'm not a huge fan of Belgian pale ales actually, but I really like that Belgian yeast character. Anything that I eat that's fermented, I like to taste the fermentation character. Back to your point about me not thinking of hops first, like I think our typical American IPAs or pale ales, that fermentation character is just a very clean American ale yeast, and then you get all the hop flavor. And I definitely gravitate more toward fermentation forward beers. And same thing with honestly, like my spirits. Like I really like a really funky, interesting rum. So I think that's something that I like throughout uh, the things that I eat and drink.
You mentioned funky rums.
Hmm.
I recently did a tasting of various rums and came to discover Jamaican styles.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um, and one of them was Smith and Cross.
Yeah, I have back behind me in my bar cart.
So I know this steers away a little bit from beer, but this
Hmm.
is a podcast about fermented foods and drinks.
Okay.
So when you go about spirits and more fermentation character spirits,
Hmm.
um, do you have any tips when it comes to also pairing those? Because those can sometimes be pretty powerful.
Yeah, I do think cocktails are hard with pairing. That's also something that I found like across the hospitality industry. They're great as like an aperitif or a digestif, but I also think once you get up in those high alcohol, even very high alcohol wines, you're starting to really have a lot of ethanol on your palate and not, tasting as much. So foods, I think, I mean, I do have to say I like a funky rum with a really bright crudo just because of that contrast. But I do think kind of keep it to before or after dinner, and with dinner have your glass of wine, your glass of beer, something a little more, or a long drink, something a little more subtle.
Great. Mandy, there's something that I've been burning to talk about throughout this whole conversation, and that is that I learned that you're writing a book.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that?
Well, luckily for me, the book is written. It's just going through, the final checking and grammar and every kind of edits. But it's called How to Taste. It'll be out in April of next year. And it's really about tasting everything. There's so many books we've both read, I'm sure, tasting beer. There's books about tasting tea, tasting whiskey, tasting cheese, chocolate. And for this book, I really talked to professionals both in the sciences and then in the professional fields of tasting everything from mustard to cheese, and talk about what's similar between all these things. What can we learn about how to taste and just be more thoughtful about our tasting in our lives. And then it ends in a section about like the relationship between our senses of smell and taste in our health. So kind of just a 360 look about tasting in our lives and how there's very practical steps to improving your taste, exercises you can do, things that make tasting what we eat and drink more enjoyable and memorable. So I'm super excited for it to be out so I can share it with everyone.
We'll be looking forward for that book, and as
Yeah.
soon as there's pre-sales, I'll be in line.
Yeah, definitely. You can taste some rums together using some of the stuff in it.
That'll be great. And I like that you take an approach that is more holistic, but also
Mhm.
at the same time, you're keeping tabs on the scientists and the specialists in each of the fields so that the type of work that you're doing is always based on facts. And that's
Mhm.
something that as an engineer and a scientist, I take very seriously.
Mhm.
So thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, something like taste, it's interesting because it's so, like we said, it's so personal, so subjective. But when there are objective facts, when we know, what the mechanisms on our tongue that are connected to our brain are, I think it's really important to let people know that so they can know that about themselves and know that that is across the board how our, bodies and brains work. And then you can build your subjective and your expertise upon that basis of facts.
That's great. Mandy, I really appreciate you taking this time to talk to me today. But for folks that want to hear and read more about Mandy, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm Beers with Mandy everywhere. So
my website, all of that. And then I write for, like I said, Vine Pair, I guess if you just Google Mandy Naglich, you can find whatever my recent work is on the news tab.
So you heard it here, folks. Go ahead, go to those places that Mandy just mentioned, follow her, subscribe to her newsletter, to everything she has going on. Look for her book as soon as it's out next year, and yeah, keep the science alive. Keep this whole approach to tasting beer and enjoying food with it alive. I think that's something that I personally live for. So thank you for doing that labor, and I wish you the very best.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Well, folks, you heard it here. Mandy Naglich, her book, and all of her social media work. You can follow the Food Engineer Podcast on Instagram and Facebook as the Food Engineer Podcast. You can also write me an email to thefoodengineerpodcast@gmail.com, or you can just visit my website, thefoodengineerpodcast.com. I'll see you on the next episode. Cheers. La música que escuchan a continuación se titula Flotando. Es un tema del señor Pedro Lavesari y pueden conseguir su música en Bandcamp o pueden utilizar el enlace en las notas de este episodio. Apoyen a Pedro comprando su música a través de Bandcamp, ya que Pedro apoya este podcast ofreciéndonos su música para nuestro deleite.